Control Group by Roger D. The cool green disk of Alphard 6 on the screen was infinitely welcome after the arid desolation and stinking swamplands of the inner planets, an airy jewel of a world that might have been designed specifically for the hard-earned month of rest ahead. Navigator Farrell, youngest and certainly most impulsive of the three-man Terran Reclamations crew, would have set the Marco 4 down all at once, but for the greater caution of Stryker, nominally captain of the group, and of Gibson, engineer and linguist. Xavier, the ship's little mechanical, had, as was usual and proper, no voice in the matter. "Reconnaissance spiral first, Arthur," Stryker said firmly. He chuckled at Farrell's instant scowl, his little eyes twinkling and his naked paunch quaking over the belt of his shipboard shorts. "Chapter 1, subsection 5, paragraph 27. No planetfall on an unreclaimed world shall be deemed safe without proper—" Farrell, as Stryker had expected, interrupted with characteristic impatience. "Do you sleep with that damned Reclamations handbook, Lee? Alphard 6 isn't an unreclaimed world. It was never colonized before the Hymenop invasion back in 3025. So why should it be inhabited now?" Gibson, who for 4 hours had not looked up from his interminable chess game with Xavier, paused with a beleaguered knight in one blunt brown hand. "No point in taking chances," Gibson said in his neutral baritone. He shrugged thick, bare shoulders, his humorless, black-browed face unmoved when Farrell included him in his scowl. "We're 226 light-years from Sol, at the old limits of Terran expansion, and there's no knowing what we may turn up here. Alphard's was one of the first systems the bees took over. It must have been one of the last to be abandoned when they pulled back to 7 Ophiuchi. "And I think you live for the day," Farrell said acidly, "when we'll stumble across a functioning dome of live buzzing Hymenops. Damn it, Gib, the bees pulled out 100 years ago, before you and I were born. Neither of us ever saw a Hymenop and never will." "But I saw them," Stryker said. "I fought them for the better part of the century they were here, and I learned there's no predicting nor understanding them. We never knew why they came, nor why they gave up and left. How can we know whether they'd leave a rear guard or booby trap here?" He put a paternal hand on Farrell's shoulder, understanding the young man's eagerness, and knowing that their close-knit team would have been the more poorly balanced without it. "Gibbs right," he said. He nearly added, "as usual. We're on rest leave at the moment, yes, but our mission is still to find Terran colonies enslaved and abandoned by the bees, not to risk our necks and a valuable reorientation ship by landing blind on an unobserved planet. We're too close already. Cut in your shields and find a reconnaissance spiral, will you?" Grumbling, Farrell punched coordinates on the ringwave board that lifted the Marco 4 out of her descent and restored the bluish enveloping haze of her repellers. Stryker's caution was justified on the instant. The speeding, streamlined shape that had flashed up unobserved from below swerved sharply and exploded in a cataclysmic blaze of atomic fire that rocked the ship wildly and flung the 3 men to the floor in a jangling roar of alarms. "So the handbook tacticians knew what they were about," Stryker said minutes later. Deliberately he adopted the smug tone best calculated to sting Farrell out of his first self-reproach, and grinned when the navigator bristled defensively. "Some of their enjoinders seem a little stuffy and obvious at times, but they're eminently sensible." When Farrell refused to be baited, Stryker turned to Gibson, who was busily assessing the damage done to the ship's more fragile equipment, and to Xavier, who searched the planet's surface with the ship's magnoscanner. The Marco 4, ringwave generators humming gently, hung at the moment just inside the orbit of Alphard 6's single, dun-colored moon. Gibson put down a test meter with an air of finality. Nothing damaged but the zero-interval transfer computer. I can realign that in a couple of hours, but it'll have to be done before we hit transfer again. Stryker looked dubious. What if the issue is forced before the ZIT unit is repaired? Suppose they come up after us. I doubt that they can. Any installation crudely enough equipped to trust in guided missiles is hardly likely to have developed efficient spacecraft. Stryker was not reassured. That torpedo of theirs was deadly enough, he said, and its nature reflects the nature of the people who made it. Any race vicious enough to use atomic charges is too dangerous to trifle with. Worry made comical creases in his fat, good-humored face. We'll have to find out who they are and why they're here, you know. Well, they can't be Hymenops, Gibson said promptly. First, because the bees pinned their faith on ringwave energy fields as we did, rather than on missiles. Second, because there's no dome on 6. Well, there were 3 empty domes on 5, which is a desert planet, Farrell pointed out. Why didn't they settle 6? It's a more habitable world. Gibson shrugged. I know the bees always erected domes on every planet they colonized, Arthur, but precedent is a fallible tool, and it's even more firmly established that there's no possibility of our rationalizing the motivations of a culture as alien as the Hymenops. We've been over that argument 100 times on other reclaimed worlds. But this was never an unreclaimed world, Farrell said, with the faint malice of one too recently caught in the wrong. Alphard 6 was surveyed and seeded with Terran bacteria around the year 3000, but the bees invaded before we could colonize. And that means we'll have to rule out any resurgent colonial group down there because 6 never had a colony in the beginning. The bees have been gone for over 100 years, Stryker said. Colonists might have migrated from another Terran-occupied planet. Gibson disagreed. We've touched at every inhabited world in this sector, Lee, and not one surviving colony has developed space travel on its own. The Hymenops had 100 years to condition their human slaves to ignorance of everything beyond their immediate environment. The motives behind that conditioning usually escape us, but that's beside the point. And they did a thorough job of it. The colonists have had no more than a century of freedom since the bees pulled out. And 4 generations simply isn't enough time for any subjugated culture to climb from slavery to interstellar flight.